Hello and good evening to another edition of the Houn Show. This is episode 11, the Bitcoin halving episode. So we'll be discussing the Bitcoin halving, and we're going to be explaining it in a little bit of a different way. We're actually going to be explaining it by looking at the issuance formula that Bitcoin uses, which is also can be called the monetary policy that Bitcoin uses. I want to encourage everyone to like, follow, and enable notifications on the channel so you make sure to never miss an episode. When we go live, you'll get a notification and you'll know exactly when we go live. So make sure you like, follow down at the bottom down there. Hit the like, hit the follow on the channel, and hit the little bell symbol so you get notifications. Very easy, no problem. I want to also let you know that you can call into the show. We do take phone calls live on the show. The phone number is 762-268-1607. You can call in at any time. Depending on what we're doing at the moment that you call, it might be a delay. I mean, you'll see me answer it on the air or on the live stream. So we'll, take the call if we can, depending on what we're going through at the time. We're going to be tonight discussing Bitcoin, as I said, but a lot of interesting things going on in the world. So make sure you also enable those notifications. So, because we typically cover 3 to 4 stories a day through the week, and it's usually after 9 p.m. we'll go live. We can't really set exact time because life happens, but that's why you want to enable those notifications so you can get through, and get told, or basically get a little pop-up that says, hey, the Houn Show is live now, and you can come check it out and see the news of the day that we've picked up on during that day or the past couple of days. So we got a lot of material to go through tonight. I've got a presentation that I've prepared, and we're just covering the issuance formula for Bitcoin, which is what can be referred to as monetary policy. And what I mean by that is how much Bitcoin is added to the supply in the overall Bitcoin network or protocol, you could say, right? I mean, a lot of people say, miners are producing Bitcoins, and, what does that mean exactly? We're not going to get into the whole mining on the blockchain aspect of it, but we're going to address what they're allowed to produce on a daily basis, and how that basically feeds into the monetary policy of Bitcoin. And the monetary policy of Bitcoin, also something to mention that's very important, is it has not changed since Bitcoin was conceived, discovered, whichever vernacular you choose to use. That policy has not changed since it started, right? So and I believe that's a record. It's the longest running financial system, or it's the longest running monetary policy for a financial system in human history that has not changed, right? Because they're always changing monetary policy. They're moving up the interest rates, moving them down, printing more money, changing quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, blah, 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 blah. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. We're going to go into what is the issuance policy for Bitcoin. And then by doing so, we'll answer the question about what is the Bitcoin halving. And I'm sure you've seen that in the news. It's been talked about a lot. A lot of investors are talking about it on the news. And so by explaining the monetary policy of Bitcoin and the formula about how Bitcoins are issued, then we'll actually answer that question, and you'll have a better understanding of why there can only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, right? And the last Bitcoin is going to be mined somewhere around 2,140, 150, depending on hash rate, how many people are mining and stuff. And not to get into all that complicated stuff, but basically we'll cover that. We'll kind of go into the frequency as to which these coins can be produced and how that's being reduced on a regular schedule. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. It's going to take a little while. I got like 25, 26 slides. But I found an article online that explains it very well. So I basically took from that some figures, images and content as well. So that way we can kind of go through this process. It's real simple. It's not too crazy of math to understand this. Now, anyway, we'll get into it. Let's get into it. So Bitcoin is a digital, decentralized, peer-to-peer money, internet money, right? And people, well, so there's a couple of different ways to think about Bitcoin. It's, a lot of people say it's a currency, but there's a lot of people say it's an asset or, digital property, like buying a condo that everybody wants in prime real estate location on the internet. So here we have, this is basically it. Now, if you're watching this stream or you're watching later on, a recording of this stream, and you know what this means, then you already got it. You already know. This isn't really necessarily a video for you. But if you don't know what this means and you're not sure how this works, we're going to go through the process of explaining this mathematical equation. But I wanted to show this first because that's it. That's the Bitcoin monetary policy, essentially. That is what controls how much Bitcoin is added to the supply. And when we say added to the supply, it's like how much gold is in the supply. They just mine more gold, or how many dollars are circulating. They just print more dollars, or take some, So that's what this is. This is the formula just for issuance. How many Bitcoin are created, and it basically controls all of that, right? And you got miners out there mining like crazy, trying to get Bitcoins and stuff, but they have to work within this formula. It cannot, it does not change, and it will never change because you have this thing called consensus. So all the miners that are mining using this formula, they can't change it because everybody else that's mining or has a miner has to agree to it, and it has to be adopted. So that's why it will never change, because if you change this limited monetary policy, your coins are going to lose their value. So that's another reason why this won't change, because nobody's going to vote to debase their own asset or their own Bitcoin. So let's head over to slide 2, and I'll just read this. This is from an article on lookingglasseducation.com, written by Daz B. Looks like May 23rd of last year, which was 2023. So we'll just read this explanation here. The Bitcoin protocol, in one respect, is an extremely complex beast. From elliptical curve mathematics, complex algorithms, cryptography, and layers of game theory that would impress the most astute military strategist. Some of the most profound features of the Bitcoin protocol, from the supply cap, the halving, block rewards, and supply issuance, can be communicated by one very simple mathematical formula known as the supply formula, Bitcoin supply formula. And that's what this is. This is the Bitcoin supply formula. This is it. You can't get much. I mean, I know it looks complicated, but once we go through this, you'll understand what these pieces mean. And this is a very simple formula. It's not super complicated. Anybody can look at this and ascertain what's going on. It's quite elegant, simple, and it doesn't have 5,000, 10,000 pages of instructions or guidelines or what have you that we currently have. And because it's so simple, it's perfect. There was a note added by the author here. So there's going to be a term that we're going to use, and the term is epoch. So it's important to understand the term epoch or epic. I guess an epoch can be understood for our purposes as simply an arbitrary period of time. Epochs do not necessarily have to be accurately defined. I might choose to define a long haul flight with 2 stopovers as having 3 epochs. After the first stopover, I can say I am now in the second epoch of my trip. So you get that. So epoch is a measurement of time, an arbitrary measurement of time, right? In his example here, he's talking about he's taking a flight that's got 3 stopovers. After he makes the first one, he's in the uh, second epoch of his trip, right? So keep that term in mind. It'll come up again later on in this presentation. So we're going to get into kind of breaking down what we're wanting to accomplish with this formula, and then identify the different pieces of this formula and how they accomplish what we want to accomplish, how the pieces fit together. And then we'll do an experiment. We'll do, we'll kind of go through the math problem and kind of spell it out at the same time. So you'll see what's going on. Okay. So like I said, keep that term epoch in mind. Here we have a diagram that basically puts a label on all the components of the formula. So we have over here on 32, we have the total number of halving epochs. We've got the symbol for the summation equation, initial epoch, the number of blocks in each halving epoch, the halving, the current epoch, and the maximum initial block reward. So I know this all seems kind of crazy and complicated, but we're going to go through each one of these pieces. We're going to explain them all and put them together. It can't be overstated the simplicity of this formula, and the elegance involved in this. So let's go ahead and get on to the next slide. Like I said, this was just a overlay with some explanation, and we're just going to read from, let me take this overlay down because it's covering up some of the words. There we go. Okay, so we have an explanation here about some of this and what we're going to do with this formula. Within this formula exists some key numbers related to how the Bitcoin protocol functions. Let's introduce these concepts in these numbers and what they mean in Figure 2. We will study these individual ingredients before throwing them together to bake ourselves the cake that is the Bitcoin supply formula. As I said, we're going to go through each one of these components so we can understand what each of them do, what each of them mean. The math. The Bitcoin supply formula is a mathematical function known as the summation equation. It is a series of plus sums. And so we'll introduce some math terms and then continue with a simple example to illustrate. Summation equations and limits. The sigma symbol, which is that funny looking E symbol, stands for, it's a sigma symbol. The sigma symbol is the mathematical symbol for summation. This symbol is usually communicated within what we call limits. And we can see that the 32 symbol, or the 32 number in the very top left-hand corner of the formula, is the total number of halving epochs. This is going to be our limit. We'll see that later on. So the limits, as mentioned above, these limits, as they relate to our summation equation, are mathematical instructions telling us the boundaries we need to work within for our math problem. In this case, those limits are between I equals 0 through to and including I equals 32. Don't worry, we're going to cover what I equals 0, I equals 32 means. So here we have three equations. And this is for the purposes of illustrating what a summation equation is. We can see equation 1, equation 2, equation 3. So, and we can create a summation equation by basically adding the results of each one of these three equations, adding the results of these together at the end, which would give us 9. 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 9. So in explaining this formula, or these sets of equations here, a summation equation is as simple as what we have outlined in figure 3. A series of individual equations all added up together at the end. But how could we represent and communicate this better rather than having to type out three separate equations? We're going to use algebra. Algebra is simply using letters to define a number, usually described as a variable. A variable is just a number that we don't know the value of, or a number that may vary, right? Variable, vary. The number may not be static. So we use a letter to represent, it's like a placeholder, so that number could change, right? And so we use a variable that equals whatever number that we need to plug into the formula. We're going faster than I thought we were. It's only been 20 minutes and we're already almost halfway through the equation. Now, if you're having a hard time following along, you can put comments, in the chat. Hit me up. Let me know what you're thinking. Is it going too fast? Are we going too slow? I can't imagine we're going too slow. We're going pretty fast. So here we have an example that we're going to use algebra, and we're going to have a letter represent a value. And so, as the author here is saying, now let us do three equations again using equation A, substituting the number x with a value each time. And so we can see here we've got equation 1 where x equals 1. And then we see 1 plus x, which is truly, if x equals 1, if x is the placeholder for the value of 1, then it's really saying 1 plus x is really saying 1 plus 1 equals 2. Well, we know it equals 2, right? But what I'm saying is the x equals 1. So if you have 1 plus x, that's the same thing as saying 1 plus 1. And in the next example, we have an equation where x equals 2. So we've changed the value of x to now equal 2. And to the right, we can see an example of that, 1 plus x. Right? Well, if x equals 2, that's the same thing as saying 1 plus 2 equals 3. And our final example here, equation where x equals 3. Same thing. We have 1 plus x, which is the same thing as saying 1 plus 3, which equals 4. So we can put whatever number, we can associate whatever number we want for x without having to change our formula. We just change the value of x. So in our equations example on this slide, let's replace the second number in the equation with the letter x and make one equation and call it equation A. In these equations, x was the variable and its value varied in each equation, which is what we saw here. We had x, equation 1, we said x equals 1, 1 plus x equals 2. so on and so forth. We changed x's value to 2. So then we have 1 plus 2, which equals 3, so on and so forth. So if we were to have x equals 4, it would be 1 plus x equals 5. So here we have another, this is what we already went through. But yes, x was the variable, or is a variable. The root word of variable, or the root meaning, is vary. It varies. It changes, right? X, the value of x can change because it's just a placeholder. We can associate whatever value we want with x, or it could be a placeholder for an output from another equation. So we can communicate what we want to achieve in equation A even more succinctly. We can do this by using the concept we introduced earlier called limits. Let's create a new equation and spell out what we mean. And so here we have, for the limits of x through to and including x equals 3, calculate the following: 1 plus x. So if we set the limits of the value of x in our previous equations here, if we set the limit and we say x can only be between, the value of x can only be x equals 1 through and including x equals 3. So that's x equals 1, x equals 2, x equals 3. That's our limit. That's all we're going to do. x1, x equals 1, x equals 2, x equals 3. So here we're talking about, for the limits of x equals 1 through to and including x equals 3, calculate the following: 1 plus x. So if x has a limit of x equals 1 through to and including x equals 3, that means we still have our 3 equations. We still have our x equals 1, x equals 2, x equals 3 equations on the previous slide. And so we basically run each one of those equations. We can communicate this even more simply using math notation. So equation C over here is effectively saying, I have 3 equations I want you to do. One equation for when x equals 1, another one for when x equals 2, and lastly, another when x equals 3. And I want you to perform this, and I want you to perform is 1 plus x. So it's going to be 1 plus x 3 times. And each time, x's value is going from 1 to 2 to 3. So it's going to be 1 plus x, where x equals 1. So the answer is 2. Then it's going to go 1 plus x, where x equals 2, and the answer is going to be 3. And then it's going to go 1 plus x, where x equals 3, and our answer is going to be 4. So how do we communicate using math notation that we want you to add them all up to? We use the summation equation symbol, sigma. When we use the summation equation combined with limits, the notation looks like this. So so using our same example that we've already gone through with our 3 equations, okay, we've got 3 at the top there above the sigma symbol, which is our limit. That's our limit, 3. We're going to start with x equals 1. So we have a limit of 3. We're starting at 1. So that's 1, because it includes the first one. 1, 2, 3. All right, so we're going to run this equation of 1 plus x 3 times because our limit is 3, which is at the top of the sigma symbol. We see the 3 there, which is above the E looking symbol. And so 3 over sigma x equals 1 is truly 1 equals 1 plus x. So it'll be 1 plus x, and it'll run 3 times. And at the end of that, we'll have a total. So we'll have 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 1 plus 3 is 4. So we add 2, 3, 4, that's 9. So this formula, this means to do the calculation 1 plus x. Substitute the value of x each time, incrementing the value for x each time from 1 through 2 and including 3. And add up all the answers at the end. We end up with a single, nice, neat-looking equation to communicate what was 3 separate equations at the start, with a final equation to add up all three, up. So, as I said, so we're doing 3 equations, 1 plus x 3 times. X's first initial value is 1 that we saw in our formula right here. So it's going to be 1 plus 1, 1 plus 2, 1 plus 3. It's going to do it 3 times because that's the limit. And then it's going to give us the sum of all 3 of those equations running. So now that we have a good understanding of the symbols and math notation used in the Bitcoin supply formula, let's look at the individual numbers within the equation and give a definition of what they mean. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down each piece of this equation and explain it. Okay, so this is the same formula we looked at the beginning of the slide. This is the Bitcoin issuance formula or Bitcoin monetary policy. And we're going to basically go and name each one of these. So we've got the I equals 0. This is the lower limit of the equation. It represents the initial epoch of time. When the Bitcoin protocol was first discovered, we were in the first epoch when I equaled 0. For each halving epoch, I is incremented plus 1. So in our previous examples, when we're looking at this formula, where we have the x, we did a lot of explanation on x equals 1, x equals 2, x equals 3. In algebra, we're using this x as a variable to hold a value, okay? And that value can be set by another equation or another formula or whatever we want to do with it. In this case, it's going to be part of the equation that is setting that value. So when you think about x, in the terms that we've already discussed. Down here, now we're going to go break down the formula. I is essentially x. It's the same thing. It's just we're using the letter I instead of x. Right? So I is going to hold a value, okay? And it's going to operate basically the same way that we've already looked at and how x was operating. So I equals x. This is the lower limit. And we've already read this, but it represents the initial epoch of time. So at the beginning, when Bitcoin was first discovered, I equaled 0 because this was the first time the equation ran, and the first value to start with is going to be 0. Now, in our previous examples, we started with 1, but with the Bitcoin issuance formula, it started with 0 as the initial value of I. So here we see I equals 0, which is our variable, 32. So 32 is our limit. 32 is the upper limit for the equation. 32 indicates the total number of halving epochs that will occur within the Bitcoin protocol. For each halving period, I is incremented from 0, the lower limit, through to and including 32, the upper limit. So 32 is our limit, and it's not going to change. So this halving event can only ever run 32 times. Well, I guess it would be 33 technically because we're starting at 0, but it can only run that many times before it's done. And when it's done, it's done. There's no more Bitcoin going to be issued. The formula is complete. It's finished its process. You can't just click it and start it over. That's it. And we'll get into what that means about supply and availability of Bitcoin, and we're going to get there. So 32 is the upper limit. That's the end of the line for the Bitcoin issuance formula. So 210,000 is a function of the supply issuance of new Bitcoin, which coincides with the number of blocks for each halving. Each period of 210,000 blocks is referred to as one epoch. After each epoch of 210,000 blocks, the summation equation limit I is increased by 1. The Bitcoin protocol is specifically designed to control the rate of release of new blocks to an average of 1 block every 10 minutes. It therefore takes around 4 years, 210,000 times 10 minutes, for each epoch of 210,000 blocks. Now, I know I threw a lot at you there, but just keep in mind, so a block is what miners are doing. That's what they're mining. They're mining blocks on the blockchain. When they successfully mine a block, it adds to the chain and they get the reward, which is the issuance in Bitcoin, right? So they get the reward of Bitcoin. The protocol awards them Bitcoin for successfully mining a block and adding it to the blockchain. Every 210,000 blocks, the I in our formula here on the left, I equals 0, it goes up 1. So right now it's I equals 0. It'll go up to once the formula, so when the formula ran, because it started off at 0, when it ran and it reached 210,000 blocks, which took about 4 years, the I equals 0 went from 0 to 1. So it therefore takes around 4 years, 210,000 times 10 minutes for each epoch of 210,000 blocks. All right, so now we're moving over to the right side of the equation, the number 50. The initial block reward during the first epoch of Bitcoin's history was 50. However, as we will see soon, this number is halved during each epoch. So when Bitcoin was first discovered back in 2009 or what have you, and I equaled 0, the reward, or 50 is static, it stays 50, right? And we'll get into the why, but anyway, so that's the initial block reward. That's what it started at, was 50. Okay, that number doesn't change. The only number that changes in this whole formula is that I equals, and it only changes that as a variable based on the upper limit each time it runs. And it runs, like we were saying in the previous slide, every 210,000 blocks, that I increments plus 1. Excuse me. Okay, that was unpleasant. So we got the 50, which is our initial block reward during the first epoch of Bitcoin's history. 2. Now this is the magic number here. When you think about the halving, this is where that comes from. This is the halving right here, this number 2. This number is how we obtain the term halving. At the end of each epoch, the block reward is divided by 2. In other words, it halves. So what that means is 2. When you divide something by 2, what happens, right? If you have 100 divided by 2, you got 50, 2 50s, right? If you have a 50 and divided by 2, it's 25, right? So you're cutting something in half because you're creating 2 out of 1. So that's where the term halving comes from, is this because of this magical little 2 that's in this formula. It's beautiful. It's extremely elegant and simple. So I, as mentioned in the previous slide, throughout the summation equation, I is incremented to within the limits of the summation equations and to coincide with the current epoch. During the first epoch, I was 0 and the equation is performed. During the second epoch, I is 1 and the equation is performed again. When we substitute I into the equation, it acts as an exponent of the number. I know we're using a lot of math terms here, but we're trying to keep it simple and explain things, but a lot of this stuff was pulled from this article. So basically what that means is, don't lose sight of, in our example equations that we went back in the previous slide where we were using x equals 1, x equals 2. I is the same thing. It's just a variable, and the value is being incremented by 1 every time 210,000 blocks are mined. And it takes about 4 years to mine 210,000 blocks. An exponent, which is what we just talked about, I is going to be an exponent of the number 2, on the number 2. An exponent is another term for power. Example, when I equals 3, within the equation, we now see 2 to the power of 3, right? I'm sure y'all remember that from back in school. Anybody who's my age, 2 to the third power or 3 to the second power, whatever. You know, it's multiplication. We see 2 to the power of 3. Otherwise, 2 times 2 times 2. Similarly, if I were equal to 4, it becomes 2 to the power of 4, which is 24. Which is another way of saying 2 multiplied by itself 4 times. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, for example. The exponent, therefore, directly affects the halving initial block reward, which is initially 50, each epoch, by acting as the exponent on the number 2. Okay? So if we're looking at this formula here, I equals 0, if I equals 0 on the left, then that means that I on the right by the 2 to the power of 0. Well, 2 to the power of 0, 2 times 0 is 0. Or 1, because you can't divide by 0, so it would reduce to 1, because this is a division equation also. 50 divided by 2 to whatever power I equals. Right? So in this equation, and we'll see on the next slide, on the left, we have our equation that we just looked at, right? On the right, we have it broken down by math. Basically broke out, showing our work, you know, like the teachers used to say, show your work. So I know you didn't use a calculator because we didn't have the internet back then. Or you didn't cheat. Anyway, so on the left, we have the original, when Bitcoin was discovered, issuance formula. Still the same today, except I equals a different number now because it's already ran a few times. On the right, we can see the math actually broke down. So we have 210,000 times 50 over 2 to the 0 power. So we're going to do the math in the brackets first on the right. So the next line, so 2 to the 0 power reduces to 1. 50 divided by 1 on the right there is 50. 210,000 times 50 is 10,500,000. That's how many Bitcoin were created in the first epoch, 10,500,000, because you mined 210,000 blocks right? And you got 50 Bitcoin for each block that you mined in at the very beginning. Like I said, that I no longer equals 0. It's now been incremented up because we've completed several epochs since the start of Bitcoin. So to perform our summation equation, we will do as we did in earlier examples. We will conduct all of our equations within the limits of I equals 0 through to and including 32, and then add them all up at the end. For the first pass, we substitute I equals 0 into the equation to the right of the sigma. Complete the equation and record your answer. Now, I left that in because I didn't realize I wasn't going to be able to reveal or do an animation, so it's okay. But anyway, so we can see, like we said, we went through the math on the right there, which is basically a kind of written out explanation of what's occurring on the left. Okay. As I said, 50 divided by 2 to the 0 power is really 50 divided by 1, which is 50. And if you multiply 50 per 210,000 blocks, you get 10,500,000. That's how many Bitcoin were produced or issued in the first 4 years of Bitcoin. Now, the answer to this equation corresponds to the total Bitcoin supply issuance during the first epoch of Bitcoin's existence, when I equaled 0. 10,500,000 Bitcoin were released as rewards to those who chose to point their computational power toward building and securing the Bitcoin time chain. Now, there's some language there that just introduced time chain and computational power, all this. Basically, all that's to say is that people started participating in mining back when Bitcoin was first discovered. People started using their computers to mine. That's basically all it's saying. And so during that first 4 years, anybody that was mining, if they mined a block, they received 50 Bitcoin. Whoa, to go back then, man, and run a miner, I'm telling you. 50 Bitcoin now is a whole bunch of money. So now, following the rules of the summation equation, once the Bitcoin time chain reached 210,000 blocks, known as block height, right? So if you ever hear anybody use the term the block height, that's how many blocks that are on the blockchain. So it reached 210,000 blocks, known as block height. The protocol incremented the value of I to coincide with the next epoch, when I equals 1. And we do the equation again, adding it to our existing record. So in this example here, we have 210,000. If I equaled 1 in our summation equation here on the left, instead of I equals 0, we would add a 1. We would make that 1 because, so the first 4 years this formula ran, we completed all 210,000 blocks. That ended that epoch. And once that ended, that I equals 0 went to I equals 1. And so now if we do the equation where I equals 1, we can see here 210,000 times 50 over 2 to the 1 power, which is basically 2 times 1, which is 2. So in the next line, we have 210,000 times 50 over 2. We do the math in the brackets first. 50 divided by 2 is 25. So then for every block that was mined, someone got 25 coins in the second epoch, which equated to 5,250,000 Bitcoin for that entire 4-year period epoch, which was the second epoch. And so the total supply, if you recall in our first equation here, when Bitcoin was first discovered, it ran with I equals 0, and there were 10,500,000 Bitcoin produced in the first 4 years. In the second epoch, we produced 5,250,000 Bitcoin. So if you add those two together, you've got 15,750,000 Bitcoin in the first 8 years of Bitcoin. So as every 210,000 blocks, that I increments up. And as it increments up, it reduces, because now the value is 25. So the next time it's going to be 2 times 2, which is 4. So 50 divided by 4 times 210,000. All right, so that's where the issuance comes from. This is the monetary policy of Bitcoin. Let's go all the way back to the top up here. This is the monetary policy of Bitcoin. It's constant. It does not change. It has not changed since Bitcoin started back in 2009. And it can't change. The only way it would change is if somebody decided to try and change it, they would go in there and try to add more Bitcoin to the supply. They wouldn't be able to, because once they did that, there has to be a consensus. So more than 50% of other people running Bitcoin nodes out there, and anybody can run one in your home, but over 50% of them have to adopt that change. If they choose not to adopt that change and stay on the original, then that change that whoever made it doesn't get applied, and it doesn't, it creates a fork, and they go off into la la land, and nobody cares because they don't want to devalue or debase their Bitcoin. So looking at this formula, you can basically ascertain what the halving is. We're coming up on 210,000 blocks mined, and this I is getting ready to go from its current value and increment up 1. So the current reward right now, just to give you an idea, originally when Bitcoin first started, it was 50 was the reward. You got 50 Bitcoin for every block that you mined. Then it went to 25. Then it went to 12 something. Now we're getting into decimals. Now it's at 6 currently. Once we hit this 210,000 blocks, somewhere around April 18th, 19th, it's going to go to like 3.125. And that'll be the reward. And it's going to keep doing that until it reaches I equals 32. Once it reaches I equals 32, and then those 4 years run, that's all the Bitcoin ever. There's never going to be any more Bitcoin mined or created or added to the supply. And that's where we get the number 21 million from. But if you do the math all the way through and you keep incrementing, or you could just skip to 32, well, you probably want to do it all. You could do it in a spreadsheet, because you want to add all all that supply that you've done a calculation for together at the end. We end up just shy of 21 million. It's like 29,999,999 something million. But that's it. This is the monetary policy of Bitcoin. It hasn't changed since Bitcoin was discovered. It can't change unless more than 50% of nodes out there agree that they want to do this, which they would not do, because the incentive is not to increase the supply, because that would devalue your current ownership of the asset. But that's basically it in a nutshell. So yeah, definitely, if you have to, replay this video a few times, or you can go and read it from the website that I got this information from, lookingglasseducation.com/the Bitcoin supply formula. It's a good article. He goes a little bit further into basically running out the math in a spreadsheet, and you can see the whole, like every epoch, the rewards. I mean, we get way down into 0.000001, right, as an issuance. So it won't be too long before it'll just be Satoshis that are being issued and not whole Bitcoin. Because we'll be at 3.125 at April 18th or 19th, somewhere around there. It's getting pretty close. And then it'll go to, in 4 years, it'll go to 1.5 or 1.6 something like that. And it's just going to keep reducing and reducing and reducing. And that's why Bitcoin is so valuable. That's why it's the best asset, because you can't make any more of it. Just like they used to say about real estate. The problem with real estate now is you got all these big investment firms buying it up. You got state governments that want to tax you to death. You got maintenance costs with it, acts of God that could destroy it, all that kind of stuff. None of those things can affect this. I'm not saying God couldn't come down and destroy Bitcoin if he wanted to. Obviously he could. And when I say acts of God, I'm talking about thunder and lightning, tornadoes, stuff of that nature. But yeah, so that is it. 52 minutes, wasn't too bad. I hope everybody enjoyed the stream tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night to cover some more news. We missed last night. We didn't do anything last night. We ran into some technical issues we had to sort out. So what we'll do is we're going to basically do the news from last night tomorrow night. And we'll be on sometime after 9 p.m. So make sure you like, follow, enable notifications. Definitely like, follow, enable notifications. So when we go live tomorrow, you'll know that we are live, and you'll be able to tune in and check it out and learn something, hopefully. But like I said, always, we appreciate everyone who tuned in tonight. We hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Friday night. And we'll see you tomorrow night. Good night, y'all.